Okay, let's unpack this because usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this comforting expectation of like engineering precision.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
You know, you break your arm, the x-ray shows a jagged white line on a black background, and the doctor points to it. It's broken or it's not.
Right. It's totally binary.
Exactly, it's clean. But the moment you step into the world of pharmaceutical contamination, specifically the invisible molecular landscape of the active pharmaceutical
Oh,
ingredients.
yeah, APIs, yeah.
Right, the APIs that make up the entire global drug supply, well, that x-ray machine just shatters. You are suddenly navigating these really muddy diagnostic and regulatory
And
waters.
muddy is a mild word for it, honestly.
Yeah, and the blueprint for clearing up that murkiness is what we are diving into today. Our mission for this deep dive is to look at the August 5, 2026 edition of the Pharmatalks Annex 15 Qualification and Validation Guide.
Which is a massive shift.
It really is, because right now, the raw active ingredients are being dragged under the exact same microscopic life cycle validation scrutiny as the final pills in the blister pack.
And that's something you, as a consumer, probably assume is already happening. I mean, the assumption most people operate under, even people adjacent to the pharma industry, is that the entire supply chain is this perfectly sealed, flawless system.
Right, like a clean room from start to finish.
Exactly. You assume every single molecule is tracked and validated from the very first base chemical reaction all the way to the pharmacy counter. But the reality of the factory floor paints a very, very different picture.
Well, we assumed it was perfectly controlled because, frankly, the consequences of it not being perfectly controlled are catastrophic.
Yeah, literally life and death.
But there was this massive wake-up call in 2020 that proved the system had a blind spot. And I mean a blind spot large enough to drive a freight train through.
It was a huge shock to the industry.
So we need to talk about that inciting incident before we get into the new rules, because regulatory agencies like the EMA or the FDA, they don't just wake up and decide to rewrite Annex 15 for the fun of generating more paperwork.
No, regulatory evolution is almost entirely reactive. Changes of this magnitude, they're usually written in blood, or at least in the severe clinical risk of a total systemic failure.
Right.
So the baseline we have to establish here is the discrepancy in the old 2015 version of Annex 15. That document has been the enforceable standard for over a decade, and it heavily regulates the facilities and equipment used for the final medicinal products.
Like the tablet pressing or sterile filling.
Exactly, the final packaging.
Right.
But for the APIs themselves, the actual chemical or biological active substances that do the work in your body, that 2015 Annex 15 was basically treated as optional supplementary guidance.
Optional, which is just crazy to think about now.
It really is. It relied on Part 2 of the GMP guidelines, which left entirely too much room for interpretation when it came to life cycle validation.
So what does this all mean? It's like focusing all your health and safety inspections on the bakery that baked the cake, right? You mandate that their ovens are perfectly calibrated to the decimal point.
You check that the display cases are sanitized.
Yeah, that the icing is applied in sterile conditions. But you completely ignore the flour mill 3 states away, where the wheat might have been cross-contaminated with a highly toxic heavy metal months ago.
That is a perfect analogy.
Because you can have a perfectly baked cake, but if the base flour is toxic, the calibration of the oven is completely irrelevant.
Exactly. And that structural flaw and oversight is precisely what triggered the 2020 sartan nitrosamine crisis, which, by the way, the Pharmatalks guide explicitly points to as the catalyst for this whole 2026 targeted revision.
Nitrosamines. Man, that was a massive wave of recalls, wasn't it? Starting around, what, 2018?
Yeah, 2018 cresting right into that 2020 lessons learned report.
Blood pressure medications, heartburn medications, drugs taken daily by hundreds of millions of people. And suddenly they're found to contain NDMA and other nitrosamine impurities, which are probable human carcinogens.
Right. And to understand why Annex 15 is expanding now, you have to understand the chemistry of that specific failure.
Because they weren't doing it on purpose, obviously.
No, the API manufacturers weren't intentionally adding nitrosamines. They were just optimizing their synthesis routes to be more efficient.
Right.
For the sartan class of drugs, forming the tetrazole ring requires the use of an azide, like sodium azide.
Okay.
Then any excess azide has to be quenched, and they commonly use nitrous acid for that, which generates nitrates.
And nitrates are half of the recipe for a nitrosamine.
Exactly. The other half is a secondary amine. And you might wonder, where do those come from? Well, they're often just present as impurities in the common solvents used during API manufacturing.
Like DMF, right, dimethylformamide.
Spun on. So these API manufacturers changed their synthesis steps, combined these reagents and solvents under acidic conditions, and inadvertently created the perfect chemical reactor for nitrization.
Wow. Just by trying to be more efficient. And because Annex 15 wasn't rigidly applied to the API stages, they just didn't have the holistic process validation to catch it.
They were totally blind to it. The 2020 Lessons Learned report cited a severe lack of process and product knowledge, weak root cause investigations, completely inadequate contamination controls.
Because they were only testing the final product for expected impurities.
Right. If you don't deeply understand the life cycle of your own chemical reactions, you aren't going to look for nitrosamines because you don't know they could be there.
That is terrifying. So the regulators realized that optional guidance was a vulnerability they could no longer tolerate.
Precisely. The 2020 report recommended mandatory application of Annex 15 to APIs, and that culminated in the joint EMA and PICS concept paper that opened for consultation in February 2026.
So the directive is explicit now. Annex 15 is mandatory for chemical and biological active substance manufacturers.
Yes. And the Pharmatalks guide lays out a very specific implementation standard for this. They make it crystal clear that companies cannot just treat this as a bureaucratic document renaming exercise.
Right, you can't just open a Word doc, hit Command F, replace the word optional with mandatory, and say you're compliant.
No, the expectation is a fundamental shift in scientific understanding at the molecular level. Companies now must integrate their knowledge of impurity formation, fate, and purge as a core, non-negotiable part of their validation strategy.
Formation, fate, and purge. It sounds like the title of a chemical thriller novel.
It really does, but it requires a staggering amount of data.
I bet. You mentioned the formation of nitrosamines earlier. So formation means you can't just know what your reaction is supposed to do.
Right. You have to map every possible side reaction, every degradation pathway, every interaction with solvents or catalysts that could create a toxic impurity.
And then there's fate and purge. What do those actually mean in practice?
Well, fate demands that you trace exactly where that potential impurity travels through the manufacturing process. Like, does it partition into the organic phase or the aqueous phase?
Does it hitch a ride with the target API?
Exactly. Does it co-crystallize? And
Huh.
then purge requires you to prove, using spike studies and advanced analytical modeling, exactly how your washing or filtration steps eliminate that impurity.
Down to safe levels, I assume.
Yes, to levels well below the threshold of toxicological concern.
So you basically have to validate the life cycle of the poison just as rigorously as the cure itself.
That is exactly it. You have to link your investigations, your recovered solvent streams, your change controls, even your raw material supplier audits directly to this process knowledge file.
Which has to introduce a massive logistical and legal friction point. Because right now, the industry is operating in this weird state of regulatory limbo, isn't it?
Oh, heavily in limbo.
Because we're looking at a proposed timetable here. The concept paper dropped in February 2026. Consultation ran through April. The draft is expected in December.
Right, with endorsement maybe late 2027 and final legal adoption proposed for April 2028.
So legally speaking, the text that's effective today remains the old 2015 version.
It does. And the tension here is between that legal effective date and the reality of industrial scale.
How so?
Well, if a pharmaceutical executive decides to wait until the final law is published in April 2028 to begin overhauling their API validation strategy, their company is going to face immediate systemic compliance failures.
Wait, I want to push back on that a bit. Because from a purely fiscal business perspective, if I'm running a global pharma network, why am I spending tens of millions of dollars right now deploying these internal Pharmatox controls based on a concept paper?
It's a fair question.
Right, because regulatory drafts change all the time. The final text in 2028 might soften the requirements. Why not just sit back, wait 2 years, let the ink dry, and see what the final law actually says?
Because you have to look at the sheer volume of work required. We are talking about mapping every product family, every synthesis stage, every intermediate isolation point.
Across a whole global network.
Across the entire network, you have to update your user requirement specifications, your design qualifications, your risk assessments. That is a multi-year mobilization. You literally can't wait.
Okay, so how do you manage that risk?
The concept you need is what the guide terms interpretive discipline.
Interpretive discipline. That
Yeah.
sounds very corporate. How does that practically function when you're training, thousands of site-level engineers and QA personnel?
It's tricky.
Yeah. How do you tell them to follow a rule that isn't fully baked without causing absolute chaos during an FDA inspection? Like, what's legally enforceable today versus what's just practice for 2028?
The genius of the Pharmatalks framework here is the deployment of 4 strict evidence classes. Every single control in this guide is categorically assigned to one of these 4 classes to prevent exactly the chaos you just described.
Okay, lay them out for me. What's the first class?
The first class is current. These are the requirements already firmly established in the effective 2015 Annex 15 or current GMP guidelines.
So this is the solid ground. If an inspector walks into your facility today, you use current class evidence to prove you're compliant.
Exactly. No debate there.
Yeah.
Moving to the second class, we have announced. These are the objectives expressly stated in the 2026 concept paper.
So the regulators have declared their trajectory, basically.
Right, like extending the scope to APIs. The critical discipline here is that you use announced objectives for readiness planning or capital expenditure
It's
requests.
doing the budget ready.
Exactly. But you never quote them to an auditor as final legal wording.
Because it's not law yet, it's just the architectural blueprint for the law.
Spot on. Which brings us to the third class, Pharmatalks. This is where the company takes active ownership of the ambiguity.
Okay, how does that work?
A Pharmatalks evidence class represents an internal, recommended operating control. It's derived from quality risk management and good engineering practice.
So it's the company's translation of the announced objectives into something actionable.
Yes. And once a company's quality unit approves a Pharmatalks control, it becomes their mandatory internal operating procedure, even if the regulators haven't explicitly mandated that granular method yet.
That's a huge commitment. And the fourth class?
The fourth class is verify. This applies to highly specific details that require confirmation against the future draft or final 2028 text.
Okay, so this is the domain of the regulatory intelligence team.
Exactly. They flag these items to undergo targeted impact assessments later, ensuring the company doesn't over-engineer a solution based on a misinterpreted draft clause.
So this whole structured interpretive discipline prevents a site director from mistakenly treating a consultation objective as final law.
Right, which could cause them to unnecessarily shut down a legacy API suite.
And simultaneously, it stops them from presenting an internal Pharmatalks strategy to an inspector as if it were verbatim Annex 15 law.
Exactly. It ensures absolute transparency about where every validation activity comes from.
Okay, so this entire framework leads directly into a massive philosophical shift that the guide really emphasizes. We are moving away from checkbox compliance.
Thank goodness. Yes.
Right. If you can't just wait for a static binary checklist of laws in 2028, how do you make defensible quality decisions today? The targeted revision heavily integrates the principles of ICH Q9R1.
Which is the international guideline on quality risk management.
Yeah, and the guide drops an absolute hammer on lazy compliance. There's this line that I feel like should be framed in every QA office. A checklist or risk score is not a substitute for scientific reasoning.
It's such a powerful statement. The integration of Q9 signals the death knell for lazy algorithmic compliance.
I want to dig into why that risk score mentality is so dangerous. Let's look at the classic risk priority number, or RPN, where you multiply severity by occurrence by detection.
The mathematical fallacy of the RPN is a perfect example of what regulators are targeting. Let's say you have a highly severe contamination risk severity of 5, but your matrix claims the occurrence is very low, a 1, and detection is moderate, a 2.
Okay, so 5 times 1 times 2, that gives you an RPN of 10.
Right. Now take a minor cosmetic defect on a packaging label. Severity 1, occurrence 2, detection 5.
That also yields an RPN of 10. But obviously, I mean, it's the difference between a pilot blindly checking boxes on a pre-flight checklist versus a pilot actually looking at the ice on the wings and understanding the aerodynamics of why it's dangerous to fly.
What's fascinating here is how much I love that analogy. It perfectly captures it. The clinical risk to the patient is vastly different in those two scenarios.
A score of 10 for a deadly contaminant cannot be treated with the same priority as a smudged barcode, just because Excel spit out the same integer. That is the exact opposite of scientific reasoning.
Exactly. The guide mandates that validation must be strictly proportionate to patient risk, process complexity, and residual uncertainty. You cannot hide behind a low RPN to avoid characterizing a complex API reaction.
And to enforce this, they require highly specific decision records, right? You aren't just recording pass or fail.
No, the guide dictates that for every critical validation decision, you must document 4 specific elements.
Okay, what are they?
First, the specific evidence reviewed. Second, the assumptions you made going into the review. Third, the residual uncertainty. And fourth, the accountable approver and the trigger for reassessment.
I want to pause on residual uncertainty because Acknowledging what you don't know is a very uncomfortable position for a heavily regulated industry.
Oh, it makes people very nervous.
Yeah.
But it is scientifically authentic.
Mm.
True scientific reasoning acknowledges that absolute certainty is a myth, especially in complex biochemical systems.
Give me an example of that.
Well, if your mass spectrometer has a limit of quantitation, an LOQ of 0.05 parts per million for a specific nitrosamine, there is residual uncertainty about what is happening in the product at 0.04 parts per million.
Because the machine literally can't see it.
Right. And by forcing the technical lead and the QA unit to formally document that residual uncertainty, you prevent false confidence.
You build a validation strategy that is defensive against the unknown, rather than arrogantly assuming the unknown doesn't exist.
Beautifully put. And to combat that arrogance, the Pharmatalks guide lists specific common failure modes to challenge.
These are basically giant red flags for auditors, right?
Yes. One of the most glaring is the use of generic templates copied across different systems without product-specific rationale.
Ah, so if an inspector walks into an API facility and pulls the risk assessment for a highly toxic oncology drug, and then pulls the assessment for a simple saline buffer,
And finds the exact same boilerplate text.
yeah, they immediately know the company is operating a paper mill, not a quality management system.
The inspector instantly knows no scientific reasoning was applied. So, to dismantle that mentality, the guide establishes 4 essential control questions every process owner must answer.
Okay, question 1. What can affect quality? The guide expects the owner to map all hazards to the critical quality attributes and process parameters, explicitly documenting the uncertainty we just talked about.
Question 2. Forces the technical lead to justify their methodology. What evidence is sufficient?
You can't just say, I'll take 3 samples.
No. The record must detail the sampling plan, the statistical modeling used, and the scientific rationale for the acceptance criteria. You literally have to validate your validation method.
Wow. Question 3 establishes the separation of powers. Who independently decides?
This demands documented quality review by an independent quality unit. The engineering team that built the process cannot be the sole authority that releases it.
That makes sense. And question 4 ensures the system remains dynamic. When is reassessment required?
The lifecycle owner must define the specific event-based and time-based triggers that will force a reevaluation. Validation is no longer a static milestone. It is a continuous state of verification.
Okay, well, you've spent a lot of time on the philosophy, the risk modeling, the interpretive discipline. Let's look at how this philosophy violently collides with reality.
Let's do it.
How does this apply to the physical life cycle of pharmaceutical equipment? Say a company is designing a new automated line for a complex biological API.
The guide uses rigidly defined lifecycle states: concept, design, build, qualification, release, and so on. The key mechanism here is the evidence gate.
The standard explicitly prohibits bleeding these phases together, right? You can't build while you're still validating the design.
Exactly. The genesis of the physical asset is the URS, the User Requirements Specification. Now, applying this new level of API scrutiny changes the depth of this document completely.
It mandates testable requirements, right? Covering
Yeah.
intended use, capacity, containment.
The emphasis on testable is where legacy systems fail. A requirement that states the bioreactor must be easy to clean is a subjective preference. It's not a testable specification.
Right, easy means different things to different people. A testable URS would be like, the bioreactor must achieve a clearance of greater than 99.9% utilizing standard wash parameters within 45 minutes.
Exactly. That precision is required because the URS is the foundational blueprint for the design qualification, or DQ.
And the DQ phase is where you prove on paper that the design actually fulfills the URS before you initiate irreversible procurement.
You have to get the engineers, QA, microbiologists, and maintenance techs in a room for a multidisciplinary review.
Because the cost of failing a DQ is massive.
Huge! Imagine procuring a multi-million-dollar crystallizer. It's built, shipped, installed. Only then does microbiology realize a sample valve creates a low-flow dead leg where process fluid stagnates.
Which is a perfect incubator for microbial growth.
And because it's a custom-machined piece of high-grade alloy, you can't just weld a fix on the factory floor without repassivating the whole system and invalidating the pressure vessel certification.
You're looking at months of delays just because the team didn't review the piping drawings properly during DQ.
Exactly.
Okay, let's assume the DQ is flawless. The vendor builds the equipment. We move to the testing phases, starting with FAT, factory acceptance testing.
Right, at the vendor site.
The company's leads fly out, witness the functional tests, verify software versions, and ensure the basic mechanics operate.
It's an engineering confidence check, but it is not a substitute for the next phase, the SAT, or site acceptance testing.
Which occurs after the equipment is shipped and assembled at the pharma facility. Now here's a pragmatic question. If I just spent a week and 50 grand sending specialized engineers to Switzerland to test this machine during the FAT, and it passed, why do I have to do the SAT when it arrives? Isn't that just redundant, expensive paperwork?
That assumption is precisely what regulators target, because it is empirically false. Transport changes the fundamental physics of the equipment.
Because of the shipping conditions.
Yeah. A cargo ship crossing the Atlantic subjects that delicate equipment to prolonged vibrations, humidity fluctuations, thermal stress. It can misalign mass flow controllers or degrade seals.
So you are testing to see if the shipment broke the machine, but it's also about the integration context, right?
The context changes entirely. During the FAT in Switzerland, that skid was connected to the vendor's local power grid, their purified water, their compressed air.
But when it arrives in New Jersey,
it's connected to your utilities, which have completely different pressure fluctuations and microbial limits. You are verifying the safety interfaces and the integration with your specific alarm historians.
This is also where the guide introduces a strict escalation rule. Do not progress past a life cycle gate when an unexplained data integrity concern remains open.
The gate is locked.
So if you're running the SAT and the machine physically performs perfectly, but you notice the electronic audit trail time-stamped a critical event 2 minutes before the physical printout says it happened.
You cannot just attribute that to a software glitch, promise to patch it later, and move the machine to the factory floor.
If you bypass that gate with an open data integrity issue, you infect every subsequent stage.
Exactly. If the data can't be trusted at the SAT level, the IQ, OQ, and PQ are inherently compromised. You must stop, investigate, and close the discrepancy.
Okay, so let's assume we clear the SAT date. The equation is integrated and undamaged. Now we transition from testing the hardware to proving it can consistently make safe medicine.
The classic trio: IQ, OQ, and PQ. Installation, operational, and performance qualification.
So if I was to synthesize this with an everyday example, say a toaster. IQ is checking if it's actually plugged in and has the right firmware.
Right.
OQ is cranking the dial to max and yanking the power cord out mid-toast to see if it catches fire. And PQ is actually making 100 perfect pieces of toast in a row using the exact brand of bread we sell.
I love that toaster analogy. It scales perfectly. But applying this to complex API synthesis is obviously a bit more intense.
Right.
Think about the validation required for the neural network of an autonomous vehicle.
Oh, that's an excellent framework. The internal logic is largely invisible, but the consequences of failure are lethal.
Precisely. For the autonomous vehicle, the IQ installation qualification, we aren't turning the engine on. We're verifying that the LiDAR sensors are mounted at the exact angles, that the internal wiring is shielded from electromagnetic interference.
And for APIs, the Pharmatalks standard for IQ mandates, verifying components, calibration, and crucially, lubricants.
Yes. If a tech used a standard industrial grease on an agitator seal sitting above a highly pure biological API,
instead of food-grade, inert lubricant,
it's catastrophic contamination hazard. IQ catches that before fluid ever enters the tank.
Once that's verified, we move to OQ, operational qualification.
Back to the autonomous car. The OQ is not a sunny test drive. It's where you stress test the edge cases. You simulate a downpour, throw an unexpected pedestrian in the crosswalk, and verify the vehicle fails safely.
You are actively trying to force the system to fail. So in an API facility, OQ challenges alarms, upper and lower limits, worst-case conditions, loss of services.
If you're validating a highly exothermic API reaction, your OQ must challenge the cooling jacket's fail-safe under thermal runaway conditions. You establish the absolute outer boundaries of the safe operating window.
And only after you prove it can survive the extremes do you move to PQ, performance qualification,
which is continuous verification under real-world conditions. For the car, it's 1,000 hours of real city traffic. For the API, it's reproducible performance using approved methods and real materials.
Now, I know the guide permits combining these stages, like an IQ-OQ, to save time, right?
It does permit flexibility, but heavily guarded by strict prerequisites. You can only combine stages when dependencies are strictly controlled.
Right. You can't use a combined binder as an excuse to run an operational stress test before an installation prerequisite is signed off.
Exactly. The sequential dependency of the science remains absolute.
This brings us to a massive red flag in the guide. It warns inspectors to look for instances where acceptance criteria changed after results are known or failures invalidated without evidence.
This is the cardinal sin of validation.
It's the equivalent of shooting an arrow into a blank wall, walking up to where it landed, painting a bullseye perfectly around the shaft, and then declaring you are an Olympic-level archer.
Yes, you cannot validate a broken process by lowering your standards to accommodate reality. If an OQ test fails, you can't just cross out the criteria and write in the lower observed value just because investigating would delay a product launch.
You can't shoot the arrow and paint the bullseye. If a failure occurs, the gate locks. You investigate.
Now, let's assume a company successfully navigates this entire gauntlet. The illusion many fall into is believing the validation effort is now complete.
They want to put the binders on a shelf and pop the champagne. But the deep dive doesn't end there. Time degrades everything. Mechanical seals wear down, sensor calibrations drift, raw materials subtly shift.
The original operators retire, taking tribal knowledge with them.
So how does the industry maintain control over years of production?
The guide addresses this with governance, data integrity, and the living system. The anchor is the Validation Master Plan, or VMP.
And the 2026 revision explicitly expands this to API manufacturers. The VMP must be a living document linked to the asset register.
It cannot be a static historical record. Every entry must link to approved evidence and define the next review date. It's the central nervous system.
And the heartbeat is the periodic review.
Yep.
You don't just blindly shut down a line every 3 years because a calendar page flipped.
Right. The guide mandates event-based, condition-based, and time-based triggers. Are the process parameters trending toward the edge? Is there a spike in bioburden?
But implementing this relies on human beings, and humans face extreme commercial pressures. What happens when there's a conflict? Say the engineering team says a batch is fine, but quality assurance spots a weird data integrity issue and wants to quarantine it.
The guide anticipates this friction. It mandates RACI matrices to enforce separation of execution and independent quality disposition. A technical owner cannot authorize their own deviation.
So you escalate conflicting conclusions to a predefined governance forum and formally record the accountable decision. You can't just yell in a hallway.
And when an inspector reviews that debate, their focus will be on the evidence, the absolute necessity of attributable contemporaneous raw data.
The LCOA plus principles.
Yes. The fatal error is accepting a contractor's PDF report that just says, all criteria met.
If you don't have the original dynamic chromatography files and timestamped logs, you cannot assure data integrity. If the contractor faked it, you are on the hook. Without the raw data, the validation doesn't exist.
Which brings the entire deep dive full circle. The 2020 Sartan crisis was a failure of process knowledge and data integrity. They relied on optional oversight.
They didn't understand the complex chemistry in their own reactors. The 2026 revision is forcing the industry to stop treating active ingredients as an afterthought. The flour mill matters just as much as the bakery.
It is a monumental undertaking, but it's the only scientifically defensible way to prevent an industry-wide contamination event.
As we close out, I want to pivot to the horizon. We've examined how Annex 15 demands perfect data integrity for physical-chemical reactions in steel bioreactors. But consider where the bleeding edge of pharma is heading right now.
Oh, this is the really provocative part.
Drug discovery is increasingly being handed over to artificial intelligence machine learning models.
Right. And if regulators in 2026 are aggressively demanding documented residual uncertainty for a physical reaction, how long until they demand this exact same life cycle validation for the AI algorithms discovering these molecules?
Yeah, that is a staggering thought. If you can't trust a black box algorithm, how do you validate its URS and OQ?
How do you execute an OQ on an AI model when its internal logic is opaque even to its programmers? The demand for raw, contemporaneous data is going to be incredibly difficult to reconcile with AI models that constantly rewrite their own parameters.
You certainly can't run a washdown study on a server rack. Ensuring the safety of the global medical supply requires a living system of aggressive scientific skepticism and relentless stress testing. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the systems you rely on, and we will catch you on the next one.